Welcome to Bookends. Bookends is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Next month's Bookends will be held Saturday, May 11th, 2024 in Wadena at 11:30 a.m. and will feature Lynn Enger and his book, American Gospel. This month, Rick Hillies? Or
Hillis.
Hillis. Rick Hillis will talk about his book, My Roberto Clemente, a book of poetry that goes from ancient Egyptian mysteries to the Holocaust. He has been described by Bloomsbury Review as being a young poet coming into his own and bringing the world with him. If you have any questions for today's author, feel free to put the message in chat. Bookends Online Edition is produced this month by Travel and Storyseller. Like other Bookends, the program will be recorded and made available on the website www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Now let's welcome Rick Hillis.
Oh,
Welcome.
thank you guys so much. What a thrill to get to talk about poetry with you, to read poetry with you, to step into I feel like it's a secular ecstatic space of the poem. You know, it's a great, great gift to be able to do that on our own, right? But also to step in that space in a communal way, and even through Zoom. You know, I know Zoom has, maybe in some circles of life gotten a bad rap, but I'm so grateful. Like it makes this possible, I want to apologize too for being a little bit late. I had to drive home from Durham. My partner, Stephanie Elizondo Greist, who's a wonderful writer, and I are at a fandango. I don't know if you've been to a fandango yet, but we're studying the music of Veracruz and the San Jarocho music, and it's a get together that has people from really all over the states and even some international people too. But anyway, I was having a little technical difficulty there, so I needed to come home to log on, which was a little sad. So anyway, I apologize for the little bit of lateness, but I also want to say that I'm happy to stay later, and I'm happy to answer all of your questions, any questions you have. Of course, there's no such thing as a bad question, just the one that maybe you don't ask. And so this is for those of you who might get a little shy in the asking, and hopefully you won't feel that way at all. Also, I just want to thank the traveling storyteller. I don't know your first name, but I love that you go by traveling storyteller. I want to
my name is Gillette.
Gillette. How do you
Yes,
spell that? With a
just like the city in Wyoming
Oh,
or
lovely.
the infamous razor company. All the E's, all the L's, all the T's. Don't
Brilliant.
leave
Yeah.
any of them out.
I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't dream of it. That's good. Well, thank you to Gillette. Thank you to Shelley. And thank you to Lena. Lena and to Georgia Court, who you all may not know, but Georgia Court is the benevolent person who runs Sarasota One Bookstore in Sarasota, Florida. And thanks to her giving a reading just at the early part of this year, I got a chance to meet Lena. And Lena very sweetly asked me to come to you based on that reading. So what a touching thing. I'm so, so, so grateful. So let me start. Now, those generous comments from we're coming on my first book called Brother Salvage, which I maybe you can see here if the glare isn't so bad. Um, it's interesting. I for this first book, I uh was discovering that I had a Jewish heritage that I didn't really know. I didn't know about it all until my grandfather's only surviving at that point sibling, he was the youngest of eight. My Aunt Vesta had told me about this Jewish heritage. And I saw this, and even though the Jewish heritage comes on my mother's side, this guy looks so much like my father. And here, this is a Shalom Schechter poring over the artifacts of the Cairo Geniza or Geniza, depending on how you pronounce that word. And the Geniza is a really interesting concept. It's basically in Judaism, no holy book can be destroyed. Any book that we deem holy must be, even if it's you can no longer read it because the spine is gone and the pages have maybe gradually faded away, but you can't maybe live with it anymore, but you have to dispose of it as a holy object. So you basically bury sacred texts, but also apparently you bury things in genizas or genizas that cause harm. This was a concept that was really revelatory to me when I was putting together this book. I had also started meeting with a Holocaust survivor who had been my childhood physician, and he just had the most beautiful, like heart-wrenching stories that also were amazing stories of survival. And he told me one story that was so heartbreaking, but also felt very sacred about a gentleman that had just an amazing wit. And whenever something really bad happened, and when he was at Auschwitz-Birkenau, when they were, I believe they were in that camp together. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. It was later in my friend's life during the Holocaust. He was in a couple of different camps at Dachau, and that's where he and this man, Israel, met. And anyway, oh, how to say this? The title poem, Brother Salvage, a Geniza, is basically, in some ways, a story of the last known moments of this guy, Israel's life, as told in my friend's Holocaust memoir. And it felt like a way of burying him because he was not given an honorable burial. But it also, how to say this, the darkness, it does seem like in our moment, especially, I don't know how the rest of you feel, but here we are with immense wars happening, and we're already involved in them, right? Of course. And there's so much toxicity, it seems, in the human story, in man's story. I think Ezra Pound talked about it as an epic subject, man's inhumanity to man. And I have sometimes wondered as a poet, like, what do we do with all that darkness, And sometimes with poetry, and I guess I'm trying to say that this concept of the Geniza was so revelatory to me because you could take also apparently things that feel very harmful and you can give them also this proper burial. And I thought, well, maybe a poem could do that too. So I'm not going to read to you the title poem. It's rather long and you can imagine it's kind of dark. But there's this poem that oh, it feels like a poem of a kind of resilience called The Last Blue Light. If this is my last flight, may I still have time to taste the darkness melting on my tongue, dissolving with the sound of sugar maple leaves blowing around my childhood home. May wind lift the leaves up to their branches and air be restored to the last season. Winter's steamy breath leaving us autumn, all shovels and rakes remaining in dust, unneeded. Let us reach our altitude, each of us humming our ascent, moving with the sounds of wet machinery. Nothing visible as we bear down through space, but the last blue light of day, glowing at the black wings, the seatbelt sign now off, and my dead friend, Michael, sleeping in the empty row beside mine. The fire highlights in his poker straight ponytail, lighting up the aria on his lap, the one he dozed off memorizing the day his plane went down. His thick lips still shivering and blue from the icy waters off LaGuardia. Nothing yet has edged us out of the sky, he says, to show he's listening. Each of us now weighs as much as the city we grew up in. And I can almost feel the sense of being occupied, of the stampede of population, everyone I've ever loved moving through sunlight and in me. And what if the dead need us too, as much as we need them? And who wouldn't give everything if it meant having them among us alive again? I have a mother who is still alive, I'm very happy to say, at 85. And she smoked for a long time. And she, when I talked to her just yesterday, she said, I still get those cravings to smoke. And it's hard to know what to do with that. After some poems, even though I'm not a smoker, I kind of wish I could have a cigarette. And that is probably one of them. It feels like such an unburdening of sorts. Um, One thing I want to say too, I come to poetry maybe like the rest of you for so many reasons. I come to it for wonder. I come to it for delight. I come to it to be changed. I come to it to be altered. And maybe even some of the puns on that word, altered, changed, but almost turned into an altar, if that makes sense. Sometimes in the world, I feel like pretty cynical about, or not cynical, but skeptical, pessimistic, sadly. And with poetry, I always feel like it opens the doors on possibility and even the doors for optimism, the doors for positivity, the doors for more perception, um, the doors of how to say it. Even the ancient pantheon of spirits seems available. The muses feel available. Like all of these beautiful things that may feel like magical thinking in my ordinary mind feel possible in poetry. I suppose another thing that feels possible or that we have access to, I guess I've heard this line attributed to multiple people, but Walter Pater, I think, is the one who said this, although we could look it up, this line about poetry aspires to the condition of music. You guys know that line? And it often perplexes me, like, what is the condition of music? But I feel like it's enchantment, it's connecting to this incredible energy. I have to say, this fandango, I didn't even really explain what that is for those of you who maybe haven't been to one. Basically, it's a musical celebration. Um, and my knowledge is that or my understanding of the term, at least as it derives from Mexico, is that it comes from this town called Veracruz. And I would imagine now that almost any music gathering could probably potentially be called a fandango. But for this fandango, they brought in a very famous jarana player. I don't know if you know what a jarana is, but I actually have one here. It's a beautiful instrument. It's a little bit out of tune, but that's just like the rest of us. We all need some attunement, don't we? But it's basically a Mexican ukulele, and it has 8 strings instead of 4. And I live in a music city. I'm based in Nashville, even though I'm here in Durham, North Carolina. But I don't know about the rest of you. I would imagine we've all had a relationship to music, and I was trying to mention this Walter Pater line, poetry aspiring to the condition of music. And yeah, for me, the condition of music seems to be one of transformation. And certainly with this Fandango experience, last night we played until not all night, just till about 12:30. And it was electrifying. This one musician, he comes from 5 generations of musicians. And apparently, this guy, Freddie, his grandfather is like credited with kind of keeping this tradition alive, and so passing it on to his children and to Freddie by virtue of that connection. In high school, I was in several very bad garage bands, and I played what a friend called sleazy guitar. I loved it, very fuzzy guitar. So this is from my first book, um, a poem called Flashlight Stories, but one section is called Fender Strat with wah wah, fuzz box, and whammy bar. For those of you who love electric music like I do. Fender Strat with wah wah, fuzz box, and whammy bar. A smeared note swells and scatters like a voice inside a cave, tugging the vibrato bar till the sound divides like an egg yolk dropped in broth. Inside you now, swirling like a geyser trapped in earth before the whole thing blows apart, as if the spirit world will talk back the more you face the amp and lean into yourself. You think there are so many ways to pray, this being, of course, another lining up of hands, a way to take the vagrant silence in yourself and make it deafening. Now it is the whole house breaking in the sound of surf, the echoes rattling the bookshelves, even without the sound. Mm. Yeah, it's interesting that that section comes from this poem. I guess I was telling you a longer poem. Well, it's a poem, a sectional poem where each section is only about 15 lines. I think of it as a chubby, each poem is a chubby sonnet, and in free verse, no rhymes or the rhymes are buried. Maybe there is this thing called a volta, which my understanding is like that translates from the Italian as the spark, the turn, the charge, the volt. Um, Again, I feel like that's such a gift of poetry. You start somewhere and you end up somewhere else. It's quite mysterious how we get there. But I wrote this poem at a time when my mother's been afflicted with bipolar disorder her whole life. And it's a remarkable thing, having a parent who you adore, who taught you love and so many things, but who has an affliction. And I've tried to, I guess in this poem, it was almost like writing what I learned of as being like a kind of ghost dance where you're trying to kind of connect to the strength of your elders. My grandparents had been so instrumental in coming to the house and helping to take care of her, but us whenever she was ill. And when they were no longer with us, I wanted to find a way to channel those energies. Anyway, I'm looking to see if there are any other poems from that section that I would read to you. Um, but maybe that sort of gives you a chance to maybe consider looking at that poem. You could find it on the Missouri Review website, Flashlight Stories, and just read the whole thing if you like. There is the one section I put in after they published it as part of a contest. Um, guess this is one section that didn't make it into the poem that won the contest. I wrote it after. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? When you write poems that are part of a sequence, you think you might be done with something, and then that sequence isn't done with you. So this poem, it has an individual title called Arcana Mundi. This beautiful phrase, secrets of the world, Arcana Mundi. After the divorce, Mom read every book she could find on the afterlife, divination, Atlantis, lost worlds, ancient cities. At some holiday party, she discovered a gift for channeling, hypnosis. One by one, she held the willing in waking sleep, walked them backward through their lives to who they were before they were. It came so easily, she said. We sat in elementary and she taught special ed at a country school in Salem. By day, her kids basked in the glow of an incubator bought out of pocket, the speckled eggs warming until they hatched. At night, she reads Seth Speaks, roaming the darkest rooms inside herself to find the opening when other voices came, as if some station buried deep inside our skulls broadcast a music you could learn to tune into. When the voices finally came for her, the flood of static never went away. Mm, 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 mm. It seems unfair not to read the last section, which sort of gets us, again, somewhere else. Maybe there's a volta we can point to. Maybe there's just a change of heart that the poem engenders of its own. Um, this one is untitled. It just begins like this. After so much build-up, who should arrive but the little Thai delivery man with the white walrus mustache, the one you always overtip because he is so old and still delivering dumplings, chicken with lemongrass on a rainy Friday night. The strangers you've opened your doors to. How many times have you held off sleep just to think again of an idling car where you could fall in love, or the jukebox in your favorite bar, how it shoots sparkling pink and green soda pop through its veins. You can never fill yourself enough with your beloved, you think, and it seems almost impossible to die. Mm. Whew. Okay. um, I think it was Gillette who was, well, actually, no, maybe it was Shelley who was giving me more of the introduction and saying that I would read from this book, my Roberto Clemente. Um, I have a couple of poems that maybe you wouldn't mind my reading to you from this book. Um, just to maybe uh, sort of check in, I think I probably want to save some time for questions, and I'm always happy to kind of go into question mode if you like, and then go back to reading mode. Do you guys have any questions at this moment? Anything you'd like to ask about? I'm happy to just sort of pull back a second if you'd like. Um, Anything? Not just yet? It's okay.
Does Does anybody have any questions? No? All right. Well, if you think of something while he's talking, you can also put them in the chat and then we can read them afterwards as well. But
Yeah,
we're enjoying the poetry, so
oh, I'm so glad. That means a lot to me. So, I guess I've been talking a bit about poetry and why I turned to it. I know, I would imagine all of you are writers of poetry too, and you turn to it for so many reasons, maybe so many more than we can even talk about or list, which I think is again a testament to the strength of having a relationship to an art form and particularly poetry. I love that it's an ancient art form. It's an art form, indigenous peoples used poetry to bring rain for crops, to bring safe passage to the dead and into whatever we think comes next. And that's still the art form. What a what a remarkable thing that we get to participate in it and to try to encounter something larger than ourselves in it. So this title poem is my Roberto Clemente. And, I don't know about you. This is an election year, and I don't want to maybe go into politics too much because that can be polarizing, but we all have wishes. And, my great wish always is that the forces of darkness will be weak, and the forces of reason and goodness and beauty and truth will prevail ultimately. This is probably a poem I was writing when I wasn't feeling like that was happening, and I needed to be reminded. I needed to remind myself that poetry, in some ways, is its own way of connecting to powers beyond us that seem benevolent, and we hope are. I think they are. I really do. Anyway, let me just read this poem, my Roberto Clemente. Doesn't everyone have a charm, like a lucky rabbit's foot, but something with the power to transform, even mutate in ways that might save us, especially when all the rules have changed? In those first board games of childhood, when house rules so often meant the power to change the rules at the house's whim, You needed your own hand-sized, get out of jail free jetpack of transformation. You needed a Roberto Clemente, your own ace in the hole. As a kid, I laid down my best baseball cards when I saw my friend put up for grabs his Roberto Clemente, the Puerto Rican Willie Mays, who was so devoted to the people of his homelands that he died delivering them earthquake relief. And now the children again are donning adult clothes. How to prevent them from running roughshod over us, but by devising our own emergency trump cards. How to take this metaphor to the next level? What's your Roberto Clemente? What's your ace in the hole? What's one thing no one can take from you? One thing not even hitmen can destroy. Sure, they can lace you with nerve agents and bone saw you all the way from the Red Sea to the Bosphorus. But once you say your piece and make peace with it, neither can be undone. You might ask, but what if I'm not around to play my Roberto Clemente, my ace in the hole? The words keep doing what you've taught them to do. The Puerto Rican Willie Mays keeps hitting another home run through the entire Anglo-Saxon tradition, as Lawrence Ferlinghetti said. Never mind, they never found his body in the wreckage of the DC-7 he insisted on writing, so one more plane delivering relief to Managua would not be diverted by one more corrupt politician, as were the first three planes. What mattered to Clemente most was that the resources got to where they needed to go. That's why we remember him and forget the rest. So, what's your Roberto Clemente? What's your ace in the hole? Mm. This poem is, you know, in this collection also. It maybe hits different notes. I suppose one thing I think about, I had the chance recently in my one of my intro to poetry classes. Well, I should say, I'm just teaching one intro to poetry class this semester and an advanced poetry workshop. But one great thing about teaching an intro class is that you get to work with students who are not English majors. And in some ways, maybe for those of you who are teachers or former teachers, it's a way to connect to you about those pleasures of like getting to relearn certain poets with them. Reading Walt Whitman, excuse me, was such a thrill, but it's interesting how, it seems like poetry, how to say this, in the American vein, in the American tradition, we still have this puritanical legacy that I feel like I myself, when I'm sitting down to write, even though I feel like largely a liberated person, sometimes like squeamishness about sex and about the body can creep in. I'm like, who put that there? And I sometimes feel like those are unfortunate legacies of American Puritanism, and maybe other less tolerant strains too. But I felt like this was a poem that was trying to address that and to get past that. Um, this was inspired by a friend who said that he was at a birthday party for a friend who was having a 50th birthday party, and they gave him a book called Sex After 50. When he opened up the book, he realized all the pages were empty. I think it was meant to be quite a joke, but when I think about it now, I think, well, maybe there's this whole other way of reading it. He was given an empty book to fill. He's given a book to like prove that there is not just sex after 50, but sex after 60, 70, 80, you name it. So anyway, this poem is called Sex After 50. Sex after 50. It's a lot better than you might think. especially if the thought of it makes you a little queasy. For one thing, your looks are just starting to get interesting, and everything else that's starting to sag, wilt, or whatever was never really what it was all about in the first place. And while it may be nice to dream that you will just lean into splendor of sensations, the splendor of sensations in total darkness, most times it's better to leave a light on and reflect on how much more comfortable you are in your skin, not to mention somebody else's. So, while you're still holding the universe in place on its axis, the two of you now pinned to each other and your shadows, holding everything, including even the outmoded notions that could use a little more entertaining these days, like the music of the spheres, which will sing its immortal shape into you the more you come to learn love in rapturous sex after 50. Mm-mm-mm. May it be so. May it be so. Um, I don't know if you guys at this point have any requests. You wouldn't necessarily know my poems, but I'm wondering, like, is there a particular color, a particular mood, something uh, you might wish? I have a poem. I'll give you that as just a moment if anyone wants to sort of say, yeah, can you read something blue or purple or red or a little more jazz, please, a little more classical, a little more funk? Anything? Anything come to mind? Otherwise, I'll just try to intuit what you may be feeling and wanting. As you can imagine, our work is never done as poets, is it? And I find myself, of course, working on another manuscript. Um, and if you don't mind, I'd be honored to read you maybe some poems from this collection too. Um, I have one poem in particular. I had a chance to read it to Lena, and it didn't seem like, it put her off at all. I think, I read it and she seemed to like it pretty well. So I have a current manuscript I'm calling A Custodian of Shadows. Um, as this next poem will show, it'll give you a window, I suppose, into work I did when I was growing up. And I suppose I'll say it's a delicate thing, isn't it? Talking to people between poems, um, and not wanting to steal the thunder of the poems. But I guess I'll just say the I is very close to this I talking to you now. Um, I realized too, when I wrote the first line, I should say, months after finishing this poem, I realized that the first line had a debt to a friend. And I figured the way to pay that debt is to turn that person's line into the skyhook for this poem or the epigraph. So a friend, Catherine Whitcomb, who's an amazing poet, her first book is called Saints of South Dakota. She has a poem that has the line, "The girl I was is almost gone." And I realized later that this first line comes from that. This poem is called Custodians. The boy I was is now almost gone. Yet everything I've done and will do is because of him. But to find that boy again, I must dredge up the bundle I was at 14 and my first job as a custodian at St. Paul's Pre-K. Mom's on disability. It's just the three of us, and I'm oldest, so I work. And already my fourth summer there, I imagine every crush I've ever had in their bikinis, lounging by swimming pools, rubbing coconut oil into their bare skin, glistening in the hot sun, as I scrub every hall and wall, each locker down, any surface that still shines with their attention, every touch, fingerprint, scuff of penny loafer, as they turn back to the beauty of their lives, soon in my hands will amount to nothing but a thin film in lukewarm water, a grease that nevertheless rainbows each time I look into its surface. Even in the braid of water, I see it as I empty the bucket in the broom closet sink. By my sixth summer, I see my future in urinals. Each toilet I flush, everything that will come to pass in the mini hurricanes of indigo, I'll find years later in Vermeer's Delft blue. I see my future in the bubblegum I pry from chairs and desks, and maybe only now do I see what Mom conceals from us in meals that keep us from wanting more. That what feels like a prison sentence commuted to community service is for the crime of posing as middle class in the affluent suburbs when we're poor. Dad lets Mom keep the house, and while he skews us to conspicuous wealth, each time he pops the clutch of his Bimmer into park in Mom's driveway to pick us up for weekend custody visits, I know precisely where we stand when he drops us off, and Mom sends me right back outside to ask him when this month's child support will arrive. Dad worked as a kid too, and though we never speak of it, I like to think he likes me more for working, but my being a janitor, I think, makes him scowl, then look deep into his lap. The custodians I meet treat me like a grandson. One Friday lunch, an old timer working on his third pension after the Army and Republic Steel surprises me with a cold, old frothing slosh to go with my fish and chips. I have more lunches with him than with my father. The summer I turned 21, my ninth there, I grow my hair long, pulled back, copper brown, straight. I fill out my t-shirt and faded blue jeans. My supers this summer in the Canton Art Museum are lifers, maybe twice my age and bigger around the arms and chest. The loading dock's garage door is open rather. Bright light and traffic noise seep in. We sit around an old teacher's desk eating lunch. The one with the dark wilderness beard says he's just gone off coffee. It makes me want to hit somebody, anybody, he says. His sidekick laughs, his hair a gray wreath of smoke, and he stands. As I choke down another forgettable sandwich, he leans in and says, "You know where they like you long hairs, don't you?" His eyes go flat back, flat black, and something like a silver dollar spins between them. Shadows dart across the walls. A thermos hits the floor. Are they really chasing me? Is this a joke? Are they trying to rape me? When the one with the wilderness beard grabs me by the forearm, he holds it like a cold one he's ready to crack open. I rest free. I run. Somehow the bearded one, dark but for a few veins of lightning, finds me. He can't look at me, but leaves a peace offering, a soapy bucket of water, a soapy bucket of warm water, and a new sponge. He wants the narrow hallway to be cleaned. I climb as high as I can on my knees, sloshing walls up to the skylight until they rainbow to the cleanest regions inside myself, and I see a life that I might live beyond the world of men. Some poems you can't even believe you wrote, and that is one. I have to thank this wonderful poet, Garrett Hongo. Maybe a number of you know him. He's been a lovely, lovely elder to me, a lovely mentor, and he really helped me. He helped push me to make that poem what it is, and I'll never be able to thank him enough for it. How are we doing with time? It's a quarter after. I was a little late, and I'm happy again to stay late, but I want to save some time for questions. Um, I was telling you a little bit too about my mother, and I think we all goodness, we all have this great, great gift of coming into the world through beautiful mothers or mothers of all kinds. I know I've had dear friends over the years who had very complicated relationships with their mothers. And I suppose, every relationship that grows has moments of difficulty, hopefully also moments of profound beauty and yeah, transcendence. This is a very new poem. I wrote it, I started drafting it really last summer when I had this great gift. Maybe some of you also like going to residency centers. If you do, there's one I'd love to recommend to you called the Baliasco Foundation in Northern Italy. Um, it's also known as the Liguria Study Center. Mm. So anyway, I wrote this and maybe this is a lovely thing to think about in Minnesota too. Like I think of that of Minnesota is the land, isn't it the land of 10,000 lakes or a marvelous place for water. I love fresh water. I'm also a freshwater person, I think by birth. But don't we crave sometimes the great bodies of water and salt water, right? So this is a poem in many ways of salt water because the Ligurian Sea, goodness, yeah, it's a great, great sea on the Mediterranean, part of the Mediterranean. So anyway, this is called Baliasco, which is a little Italian town right on the water, the Ligurian Sea. Baliasco. The real feeling I have beyond gratitude that lasts longer the more I see this emerald coast in daylight or at night, Brancusi moon, first stars, a cooling breeze, is how guilty I feel that I'm the one who gets to see it and not my mother, now mostly living in her chair, which makes me rub my eyes as I watch the sunset. And because I'm nothing if not my mother's son, I think of how much she'd love this coast and her one painting I know of that survives, its lean box open in the basement, of a white Hokusai wave breaking on dark rocks by a sea. Just thinking of it, I start to feel another breeze across my skin, giving me goose flesh. The ease of it conjures the heart of her painting, a red sunset where already parts of paint flake off. Now see how in this painting, likely to be my mother's last, that the sunset itself has become so bright, it's burning through the canvas, singeing the air. Once I saw midnight in my mother's lovely hair, and copper highlights bright as a custodian's keys to rooms that opened for her in another life, a life I don't have access to. So I stand out in the sun and hope this sudden illumination of her will last at least long enough for me to begin to see past the rooms of darkness to those holding mercy for my mother and myself and us. The fresh air here helps me imagine a place more luminous and vast, whose shutters, even in trompe l'oeil, open with ease. So I can imagine her taking in these turquoise sapphires from the seat she's confined to now in her sunset life. And don't we all want our mothers to know a good life and its mercies? And mine is happiest by the sea, where all the shattered light of the relentless sun spellbinds her. The whole turquoise surface sapphires her silver white hair, now so alive in the breeze. How I pray a moment as good as this might be her last. And even if her last painting crumbles into the sea, I am her son. And so I carry her and her image in me like keys that find new uses wherever I go. Now I need a drink. Water will do. um, oh my. So is this a good moment for questions? Anybody have a
Yeah,
question?
this is usually the part where we
Yes,
we
please.
start doing the questions. So yeah.
Yeah.
I'll get started. So what I guess a lot of us are curious about origins.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
where were you when you realized you were a poet and that this was what your life was going to be? Like what led you to be a poet?
This is such a great question. I mean, I feel like, I mean, you can hear how much my mom is in my poetry and in my life. And I mean, goodness, there's a wonderful poem by Richard Wilbur called To the Etruscan Poets. Do you guys know this poem? I think it's a very short poem, and it may go something like, Dream fluently, still brothers, who with your mother's milk, you know, took on the mother tongue, in which pure matrix joining world and mind, you hope to leave a line of verse behind, not reckoning that like a track footprints in freshly fallen snow that all could come and go. But I like that little poem for me, it's something that came in through my mother's tongue, through her mouth, and the beauty of the mother's music, probably inseparable from the milk that I was taking as first nourishment. But I don't know about the rest of you, but I tried a number of other art forms, and I still love to draw. Art was really, it seemed like others were saying to me I was good at it, and I thought, okay, well, maybe this is what I do. Um, but mysteriously for me, the more I devoted my life to writing, the better my life became. And really, once I started listening to that, which probably, yeah, this is weird. When I was in high school, I think I mentioned being in several bad, garage bands. And I had a lot of fun playing noisy guitar, but inevitably there are those band breakups. And I was in a band that broke up, and then I was in a class with the drummer, and apparently I wrote a poem that he liked enough. He's like, well, this guy's not so bad. Maybe we'll be in a band together again. And we did get together again, and I maybe only later realized that in writing was really where I was stepping into these enormities. I mean, the music sort of suggested them, but I think I don't know, it's a lucky confluence for those people who, you know, end up being like in the John Paul, George, and Ringo category, where you find people like that with whom you make music for the rest of your life or for a great part of your life. And I guess I needed something more a cappella, more on my own. And I'm so grateful for it, truly. And how amazing that I get to teach and that poetry ends up being something that I've never really felt like I have to compromise my vision. I just have to keep expanding into what I think I can do as a poet. Yeah, so probably there were glimmers of it in grade school, high school, junior high, but it really wasn't until college when I was like, oh my goodness, this is really my thing. I was at a big state school. I had got very lucky to get a scholarship to go to the Columbus College of Art and Design in Ohio. I was there for a year. I transferred to Kent State, a big state school where a lot of the classes were taught by people in the Ivy League and also people who weren't, just wonderfully knowledgeable people. And there was like the Kent poetry scene, a lot of wonderful poets who are part of it. And I'm just grateful to have been around these lovely people who sort of had this profound respect and love of poetry, who, how to say this, they had a lifelong commitment, but there wasn't an expectation of like professionalism, and I was grateful for that, just seeing that poetry can be a way of life and there were many ways to live in it. And for me, I just kept getting lucky, getting to teach or getting fellowships that had a teaching component. I could never have planned my course, my particular life. It changed my life to go to graduate school. I got to go to Columbia University after being a state university kid and what would you say, a state school kid or a public school kid. I believe in public schools. Movements to defund them, I think, are at our collective peril. And so, anyway, but getting to go to a great private school changed my life. I met people there who have been with me, until their recent passings, and they're still with me, which is a great thing. I hope I didn't take too long to answer that question. But yeah, it felt
Oh,
like it was something I may have had from the get-go, but it took me a while to hear it, like to know that it was my path. And maybe I'm still
yeah.
learning. I'm still learning.
Well, it
Um,
seems if you think about it, a lot of songs are poems set to music. So there's
Absolutely.
there's a there's a closeness between music and poetry in a way.
Such,
How do you
yeah.
think, yeah, I'm sorry. How do you think writing poetry differs, say, from those who are prose writers or, writers of fiction or stories or nonfiction? Is there a different sort of methodology in working life, or is it still the same sort of you get up and you write?
Well, I think there's a lot of the latter. You get up and you write. This is interesting. One great gift of teaching where I do. So here I am again, a product of public schools and public institutions and some private schools too. And teaching at a private school, Vanderbilt University, where so many of my colleagues are these amazing poets and fiction writers. I don't know if you know this fiction writer, contemporary fiction writer named ZZ Packer. She's an amazing writer of fiction, and she adores poetry, and we've become dear friends. And we're talking now about team teaching a course sort of on these borderlands between poetry and prose. So in some ways, like I'm excited to teach that so I could answer your question better, you know.
Yeah.
But I have a sabbatical coming up next year. Oh, and I think I have to tell you, I'm interested, of course, in continuing with the writing of poetry, but I'm really interested where prose begins too for me. And I keep being told by prose writers, oh, my poet friends have to write more prose because you guys do it so beautifully, and at this Fandango, I have to say my Spanish is probably the worst of anyone's, but I found myself introducing myself and saying, lo siento, I'm sorry. My Spanish is like a little kitten whose eyes are just starting to open. But I found that that is also a beautiful way of thinking about our relationship even to poetry and writing. Like our eyes are continually opening. And even this borderline, I don't know, maybe it's a false borderline. In some ways, maybe we're better off not even thinking so much about genres and just allowing ourselves to write. I had a class in grad school with this wonderful editor. I don't know if you would know him, Ted Solotaroff, who had worked with Harper and Row when it was called that before it became
Yeah.
Harper Perennial,
Collins.
and and he also was an editor for the American Review. Um, anyway, he said something really lovely about, you know, allow what you write to expand so much that it tells you what it wants to be. Like that you listen to what you're writing. And, if you're writing something that needs to go all the way to the right margin as a poet, allow yourself to do it. There is this thing called the prose poem, which is a wonderful hybrid place, right? Where it can exist in poetry, it can exist in prose. My prose friends call those pieces short shorts, which is obviously a sexier name than prose poem, right? But the short short, can partake of the energies of prose. My one of my friends who I get to teach with, the fiction writer Tony Early, often talks about there being an engine of storytelling in prose for him. And if that engine isn't present, he's thinking, well, a story, may need to have that. I tend to think, well, if the music is driving you, you're probably still a citizen of poetry, but don't we all want a passport to multiple countries, and sometimes when we're writing, maybe we do get that expanded passport. And maybe going back to what Ted Solitaire was saying, maybe it's just important for us to listen to our subjects, and maybe sometimes they need a broader canvas that could be, say, in prose, even if we're writing a more lyrical prose. My friend Zizi Packer, the one that I was telling you about, who wants to team teach a course with me, I think we both talk about, how lyricism, pervades the prose that we love and the poetry we love. So like already they seem kind of linked indelibly. And maybe genre is something for others, to tell us at some point we're trafficking or navigating. But maybe it's good for us to not be too caught up in the distinction, but to allow ourselves to travel into the borderlands. I don't think those borders are overly policed or overly they can be uh traversed. You know what I mean? We don't need necessarily a Virgil, you know, to guide us across those boundaries. The language is there for us to explore those boundaries, those maybe still to be discovered trade routes. Maybe it's for you to discover those boundaries. And maybe the more I'm talking, you can probably hear me trying to talk myself back to the possibilities of traversing those boundaries between poetry and prose. Yeah,
Well, I think there,
yeah,
yeah. No,
please.
I think there are some people who write prose that is very lyrical and almost poetic,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
there's some poetry that's seems more prose like. But I
exactly.
think too with the genres that
Mhm.
it's almost like from a seller perspective, you start to realize as you're trying to categorize books that some books could go into two or three different genres. They don't fit nicely into one. And then you start to realize that genres seem more like a bookkeeping system than anything else, a way to sort of just help people narrow down
Hmm.
from when you think about the pure volume of things being written.
Oh yeah.
It's more of a bookkeeping sort of system.
That's right. That's right. It's sort of in some ways, yeah, bookkeeping away. It's interesting too. You look at, even your own books, and it may say poetry slash nonfiction, or and I love what you were saying too about the uh how to say this. Uh, increasingly we can talk about like multi-genres or genre blurring writing, right? And maybe this is something that may energize a number of you too as writers. Like, how do you incorporate aspects of memoir, and maybe even for those of us who are interested in one day writing a memoir. Um, I was at the Texas Book Festival a number of years ago, and I wish I could remember the name of the Latino novelist. He was writing his first novel in his 60s. He was a poet. And at one point during the Q&A, someone asked him, how did you do it? How did you write a novel? He said, I just started unbreaking my lines, you know, sort of restoring them to the long line. Of course, they'd be retaining the energy, the lyricism of poetry, and in this way, sort of reacquainting himself to the pleasures of of the paragraph, and maybe getting away from the stanza, but or maybe allowing the stanza to have this larger definition where it includes, the prose block. Anyway, it's interesting, isn't it, how the learning continues. And I suppose as we maybe push ourselves to write more, I think uh, Samuel Beckett, when asked about writing, he said, but I have to put a stain on the silence, and what sort of stain do we want to put on the silences? Maybe sometimes that asks of us a kind of stretching, a kind of growing beyond maybe what we've done so far. And this, I guess, brings me back to the Ted Solitaire idea of not limiting too quickly what you're writing to one genre or another. And maybe as Shelley was so wisely adding, like, yeah, you can allow yourself to have a work that could contain poetry and prose and be maybe, this is a way we could, be listed in the nonfiction part of the bookstore and still have poetry in our manuscript, right? Because I think poets, all of us, if we're lucky, maybe one day we could get the kind of advances that our nonfiction friends get. Not to bring it back to money, but we need to survive too. If it all comes back to poetry, I think it reinvigorates poetry. So in many ways, there's no harm. It's a great way of increasing the nutrient in what we do. Again, and I think part of what we do is about that. And these gatherings like this, to me, I can't tell you again and thank you all enough, like, just for inviting me to join your ecosystem. Even through Zoom, I feel in touch with like a beautiful nutrient, so the sustaining energies that I hope you all feel like you connected to them too. I feel totally enriched. My immune system feels stronger. And yeah,
Good.
I can't thank you enough for that too. Any other questions too? I know we're going a little bit over, but oh yes, please.
Lori.
Lori, yeah.
I while I have a chance to talk,
Yes,
just
please.
really
Please.
want to thank you so much.
Mm.
It's kind of like you just planned this whole thing for me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it really, your poetry and this craft lecture was like exactly what I wanted. It's kind of spooky, actually. Uh,
Wow.
I have come to poetry late in life. I'm
Mm,
74, and
mm,
visual arts has always been kind of what my lucky thing. that lucky thing. But poetry is kind of something I'm working on now, and the Haibun is
Oh, yes.
an interesting combination of prose and haiku,
Mhm.
which I've been enjoying quite a bit. But actually, I do have a question for you,
Yes,
and I
please.
think it's experience, and I think it's reading others. But I
Mhm.
tend to be very literal, more literal than I want to be, as probably many of your students are. How
Mhm.
do you develop that sense of like metaphor and and imagery that leads people to what you're saying as opposed to just
Mhm.
telling,
Yeah.
outright, which is your first kind of inclination if you're new to poetry, or even if you're not? I imagine
Mhm.
there's a literal space where things begin, but then they're augmented by this the beautiful use of the language.
Mhm.
So please talk about that a little bit.
Yes. Oh, that's so lovely. And oh my gosh, Lori, can I just what a gift to be able to provide something that was what you needed. I mean, I feel like it's a moment where you feel like a vehicle again for something totally beyond you, more than what you could have planned for. So like, yeah, huge gratitude to the forces I don't even know making this
Me
moment.
too.
Truly, truly. Now, to get back to your question, being literal minded, I think is its own gift. Um, but as you were saying, certainly like how to develop a sense of metaphor and imagery. Now, coming from visual art, I would imagine that image making is so instinctive for you. And I would imagine, returning to the beauty of the image, maybe sometimes the beauty of the tactile sense. I like you, I started out more as a visual artist, and I always find myself missing that tactile sense, the kind of moving in the body that writing may not enable us to have to the fullest extent of things. So maybe there are ways of, well, I often, will do a kind of right walk, which is to say, most mornings when I can, either after yoga with my beloved, or even the morning she can't do yoga with me, I'll go to a park, I'll walk, and I'll just start taking in imagery, describing the trees. I remember, being at a lecture with Seamus Heaney. He came to one of my grad classes, and he talked about the beauty of just being able to write one unforced line that was just like, and the rain fell through the alders. Isn't that like a beautiful line? But getting lines that are describing the natural world, and even just as you see them, or um, Elizabeth Bishop has in a notebook, you know, a gray hair like a shooting star, and like what a lovely use of simile, right? So maybe some of that is just actually doing what you were probably trained as a visual artist to go like doing life studies as to steal from, probably to steal back into visual art what Robert Lowell used to title his third collection, Life Studies, right? Um, the world is seen through your own eyes. So anyway, that's one way of getting imagery back. Now, metaphor is an interesting thing to think about too. And I guess this enables me to think about in recent weeks, talking in my intro to poetry class about Walt Whitman and about Emily Dickinson, our great 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 granddad and great 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 grandmother of American poetry, right? Now, Whitman was called by Harold Bloom a genius of synecdoche. You know that term? Do you know that word? SC. It's one of those words I have to sometimes CHNDOCHE. Oh, my handwriting is kind of terrible. Is that backwards too, of course, probably. Synecdoche. These two words, so synecdoche and metonymy. Metonymy is easier um, to spell, Metonymy. I hope that those are close enough. You can Google them. But synecdoche is basically when a part is of a larger whole, you know, where there are moments when Walt Whitman is talking about one thing and it becomes part of this greater whole. Um, but there are also moments where he's totally speaking metonymically, which is often so metonymic uses of language are fascinating too, but often we have them all the time in ordinary language, whether we talk about the crown, instead of talking about, say, Prince Charles, or we might, in journalism, one way that our great journalists, the great fourth wall of democracy, one way that journalists protect their sources, which they have to do, especially in our moment, we can see how people want to reach out and trash people who are, you know, providing, information. But sometimes we'll hear White House sources today said da 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 da. And White House is used in this metonymic way, right? The White House is closely associated with the president, and it becomes a way of talking about the president or the cabinet or sources close to the president saying something. Um, we probably would need a lot more time to speak about metonymy and synecdoche, right? But I guess what I would encourage you to do is to go to Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, one of the great, durable, first great epic poems of this new American experiment, right? That we're all still very much a part of. And to look through those sections and look what he does to kind of, talk about, to use images. He'll say, there's that one section, a child fetches me, with two hands, grass, and like asks me, what is the grass? And the poem could have ended when Whitman says, how do I know any more than he? And then he goes, but I suppose it is a uniform hieroglyphic and growing in broad zones and narrow zones among Canuck, Tuckahoe Congressman Cuff, among black folk as among white. Even like the grass is this emblem of democracy, right? Sprouting among, well, and Congressman and Cuff, like having an instance of what Mark Strand, I understand, called democratic syntax, where, just by the organizations of things in the language, they become part of a larger totality. So anyway, in some ways, it does uh, um, get back to what you were saying, Lori, you were saying a second ago, like that probably it will be reading that will help you solve this, right? And just doing more reading. I think nothing is as good as just reading more, of course, but going to Whitman, and I think in many ways Dickinson is a genius of metonymy, where these and profound figurations start creating these hinges to more connection. Whitman does it at certain moments. And I guess I should say, I think synecdoche is a part of metonymy, if I'm not mistaken. These concepts do get a little blurry, but they are ways of reaching out to larger totalities and into more figuration. So I think, Lori, these could be ways of getting more figurative language, into your idiom, into your innate way of speaking, if that makes sense. Yeah. Is that helpful? Lovely. Any other questions? Yeah.
Actually, we're gonna run out of Zoom time.
Oh gosh,
Um,
okay.
to take these last couple of moments just to thank you so much for coming and for your great presentation and your lovely poetry and everything that we learned here today. And we very much appreciated having you as a guest.
Oh my goodness, I would come back anytime. You guys are absolutely lovely, and you clearly have created a very special thing. Thanks also to Lena too, for your involvement. Uh, it sounds like Lena has been involved with the Historical Society also for quite some time, and yeah, I thank all the forces that brought me to you, and now our lives are connected. And please reach out anytime when, with other questions, or just send me an e-postcard. I think one of the great beauties of poetry is it connects us indelibly. And in a year where we have a lot we're bracing for, elections and other things, we need to stick together in beauty and truth and in all the good things. So I wish you all just, the most beauty of this weekend and of the continuing project of your own lives. And let's stay in touch, okay? Be well.
Absolutely. Well,
Mhm.
thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Mhm.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.